There are many subjects that could be presented this morning. We could talk about the beauties and the riches and the glory that's found inside of heaven. Or we could talk about the depths, the pain, the suffering, and the aloneness that's found in the place that's called hell. We could talk about the Lord's church and the beauties that are found in assembling together inside of worship. We could talk about Bible study and how it nourishes and enriches the soul. But today we're going to talk about marriage. And specifically, to give you a clue, every month of this year, we will have one Sunday morning sermon that centers around the family or marriage in the home. And specifically, this particular lesson, we want to ask a question: what is marriage? Because it seems that our society is a bit confused on that question. And what we want to do is take a biblical look upon marriage qualities, because we know some things. God created this world with His sovereign power. And it's this same power in which He created you and He created me. After God had created everything, we read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, in the middle of that verse, "And behold, it was very good." The things that God created were good. And they were created for good. And mankind was created by God, who is good. And marriage was instituted in this creation, as was read in our reading just a moment ago in Genesis chapter 2, verses 23 through 25. Where Adam says, "This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." Marriage is a joining of two into one. But it's something that's so important, because inside of marriage, there is no shame. The harsh reality about this, though, is the fact that marriage is hard. Marriage is something that was created by God to make mankind stronger. But we have to face some realities. In the country that we live in, pure statistics show that 4 out of every 5 adults, 18 years and up, 78% of the population of this country has been married at least once. And we learn that the statistics of those 78% of Americans, that at least a third of them have been divorced at least once. This means that among Americans 18 years old and older have been married, 25% of those people have gone through what's called divorce. One report shows that 60 to 67% of second marriages fail, and 70 to 73% of third marriages fail. And the statistics continue to go on. Marriage is hard. But marriage was designed, it's something that was created by God to make mankind stronger together. And thus we learn something about marriage. Marriage is something that can be improved on the human side. There will never be a day in which God has to correct marriage. But there is a day in which we need to understand, we need to look at our marriages. Now, understand what I'm not saying this morning. I'm not saying that 25% of you have problems in your marriage. I'm not saying that a third of you have problems in your marriage. But I am saying that in our marriages, they can be improved on our sides. You see, God has given the standard for marriage. God has given the recipe for life. God has given everything that we need. And usually we learn that we are the ones that let ourselves down. Today's discussion is going to go into 4 different areas. Number 1, we're going to ask the question, what is marriage? And we're going to answer it with the fact that marriage is something in which God must be there. Then we're going to ask the question, what is marriage? And we're going to answer it with this statement. It's a place in which we must be fair. Then we're going to continue to ask this question, what is marriage? And we're going to talk about how companionship is something that should last. And then in the last place, when we ask the question, what is marriage, we're going to remember something. We're going to remember the day that we were married. And we're going to realize that marriage has vows. And every person in this room that's married took those vows. We're going to talk about those, and then we're going to get an idea of what marriage is. To enter into this particular idea, we must understand that marriage is something in which God must be there. You know, God has always been concerned about the smooth operation of marriage. God has always been concerned about the smooth operation of marriage. Inside of God's Word, you're going to find a multitude of commandments, principles, teachings, and guidelines in which are given for maintaining the holy and peaceful relationship inside of marriage. Many times in the Word, you're going to find specific references to the word family. And we understand when we're talking about the word family, a marriage is involved. You're going to find this in passages and books like you would not imagine. The book of Deuteronomy has a heavy theme on marriage and the family. The book of Proverbs, as which you could imagine, has a lot to say about marriage and its relationship. You can think in the New Testament to passages like, or sections like Ephesians chapter 5. And you understand the contrast that is made in Ephesians chapter 5 between marriage, man and woman, and Christ and the church. God has always been concerned about the smooth operation of marriage. But inside of this idea, usually what happens is the fact that we should understand that God should be the center of our home. And usually the problem inside of marriage is when problems arise, God has no longer become the center of the home. You see, usually what happens is one or more people will make themselves the center of the home, where everything revolves around them, where everything involves them. And they forget that everything inside of a family, everything inside of a marriage must revolve around God. God should be the center. You see, when you made your vows, when you were married, it was not just a marriage relationship or a vow made between you and your spouse, but a marriage takes 100% from the wife, 100% from the husband, and 100% from God. It is a Christ-centered obligation. But you know, we learn this from passages like Malachi chapter 2, verses 10 through 16. And in that particular scene, we learn that the people of God, the Jews, they had forgotten this fact. They had forgotten the fact that God should have been every center, every point in which they lived. You see, in the work in which we do in this physical world, God should be the center of our work. Because our attitudes, our relationships with those that we work with, He should be the center, and thus our relationship should be correct. In our families, specifically in our marriages in the second place, God should be the center. Because we understand, when we look at the picture of God, we understand how the picture of marriage should be, of Christ and His people. You know, God should be the center of the home when we're talking about the parent-to-child relationship. That's a wonderful relationship, isn't it? There are many joys in which I never thought could be expected until I became a father. And I understand those joys. And you understand those joys because of the joy that's found inside of the Lord. God should be the center of everything that we do. You see, when the Jews forgot about God as the center, you look at Malachi chapter 2, verses 10 through 12, and idolatry became the problem. When you think about your worship, who is the center of your worship? You see, it's not the elders, it's not the deacons, it's not the preacher, it's not the members. God is the center focus of worship. And that which these people in Malachi chapter 2, 10 through 11 had forgotten was God. And in their worship, they moved over to idolatry. Verse 13 in this particular section shows us that they were insincere in worshiping the one true God. There will never be another one true God. There is only one. And they forgot that. We learn in verses 14 and 15 that inside of the family must be the center of God. They had forgotten that. But I want you to look at verse 16. They were putting away spouses as fast as they could. And many times that boiled back to the fact that God was not their center. You see, there's something that must be true in every marriage. Whether we're talking about the continual lasting of this marriage, the relationships in the marriage, the treatment of the marriage, and the attitudes about marriage, God has got to be the center. He must be. Otherwise, we're focusing upon self. And we will be like those in Malachi chapter 2, God's people who forgot about God, and they put away every relationship that He had created because they became the center focus. In your marriage, I encourage you, let God be the center. Number 2 this morning, we must understand that inside of marriage, looking at the qualities of marriage, is this fact. We must learn to be fair. We must learn to be fair. Now, I understand something when a younger man who is 28 years old stands up before a room in which has been married longer than I have been alive. I understand that there is much more wisdom in the audience than there is in the speaker. But there is one principle that will always be true. We must be fair. And we don't think of that principle very often. This means we need to treat each other kindly in the daily affairs of life, in everything that's just going on in the day-to-day. I'm talking about parents and the way we handle our children. I know many of you know this, but I want to say this. Fathers, you're a parent also. Don't leave it for your wife to do all the work. Don't forget that. It's your role, it's your place to be there for your family. And a way we can treat our spouses unfairly is to leave our wives, men, with all the work. Whether we're talking about children, whether we're talking about the home, it doesn't matter. We must treat our spouses fairly. And the same can be true on both sides of that coin. But we must be a people who treat each other fairly. Go with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. I want us to see something in 1 Corinthians 13 that we've looked at many times and is a scene that we talk about in marriage many times. But I want you to see just a simple point about how love or kindness is necessary in all of the affairs of daily life. If you look at 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 8, you'll learn the concept of love, the concept of kindness, the concept of being fair in life has to do not only with what we do, but what place we put self. You know, this point, we must be fair, comes aptly behind the point that God must be the center of the home. Because inside of the center of our lives must be God. And if God is the center of our lives, we will understand that we're not the center of our lives. and we're not the priority in our lives, and we'll understand that the things we do affect everybody that's in our lives. The things we do will affect everyone in our lives. And we understand in verses 1 and 2 that if we have all things, if we have everything in which God could give mankind during the time that's being talked about of chapter 13 of spiritual gifts, we'll understand that if we do not have kindness, if we do not have fairness, if we do not have what's called love, we have nothing. Families are built stronger in many areas, and their fairness has many things to do with what we do in our lives. And there are two areas in which I believe we can work better in our marriages, in our relationships one to another as well, is number one, kind words. Go with me to Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4. As you look in Ephesians chapter 4, go all the way down to the end of the chapter, and I want you to look at verse 29. Now understand, I agree with you, this is not in the context of marriage, but it has to do with what we do in our lives, and our lives have everything to do, men and women, with our marriages. Verse 29, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth. Now notice this, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. Let's apply this principle not only to our lives, but to our marriages. In our lives, the things that come out of our mouths should be the things in which minister grace and give edification unto the hearers. Notice the responsibility is on the one who is speaking, not to himself, but to the ones he is speaking unto. Now apply this to your marriage, and apply this to the fairness that should be found inside of marriage, the love, the kindness that should be found in marriage. Men and women, our words mean everything. Our words mean everything. It's a principle we find inside of Scripture. Your yea should be yea, and your nay should be nay. We understand that our words should be. But verse 29 shows us something. Our words should be that which build up, and especially when we start talking about our marriages, our words are extremely important. Then in the second place of this idea, we need to give common courtesy. Go with me to 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians, and go all the way down to chapter 8. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Common courtesy. This is really the principle that we need to be nice. We need to be nice one to another. Recently, Kelly and I and some of my family were eating at a restaurant in Lawrenceburg, and my mother went to go get a drink, and there was two little children there. And her mother was trying to help them get the drinks, and she told the children to go, and as my mother walked up, this interacted. The two little kids looked up to her. They were just small. Excuse me. And they went on to where their mother told them to go. Now, that doesn't mean a lot to some people, but that young mother looked to my mother and said, I'm trying to teach them to be good people. And she said, oh, they were. They said, excuse me. Common courtesy. You see, we understand it in things like this. It's like opening the door for someone. It's a common courtesy. But what happens when we apply common courtesy to our marriage? Look with me in verse 21 of 1 Corinthians, or 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Providing for honest things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. It's easy. It's extremely easy to have a good marriage at the worship assembly. It's really easy to have a good marriage when you're out at a restaurant, or maybe when you're at the store when other people are watching. But what do our marriages look like at home? You know, we should be people who provide for honest things in the sight of the Lord and among men. You see, sometimes when we're home, our marriages are different, and they should not be. Our marriages should be filled with common courtesy in every aspect of what we're doing. Think about what you do, when you do, how you do, everything in every relationship that you have. Because inside of marriage and inside of relationships, life is not a one-size-fits-all mentality. I don't treat my spouse the way I treat you. And I don't treat you the way I treat my spouse. And I want to tell you something. I don't want you treating me the way you treat your spouse, good or evil, because that belongs to my wife. And men, it belongs to you, your wives. And wives, it belongs to your husbands. But we need to be aware of everything that we do, because life does not just happen in public. It happens when we go home. So our marriages must be filled of kind words and common courtesy, and we must evaluate everything that we do. Here's the third thing in our question to define what is marriage. Marriage is something when our companionship, well, it lasts. Our companionship lasts. Go with me to Matthew chapter 22. Matthew chapter 22. Now, I understand that we do not oftentimes turn to Matthew chapter 22 when we talk about marriage. But there is a principle that's being laid down in Matthew chapter 22 in which we cannot misplace in our marriages. You know, when we apply regular principles that we apply to regular people in our marriages, we get extraordinary results. And we begin to see the grand point that Jesus is making. Go with me to Matthew chapter 22 and go all the way down to verse 34. To verse 34. A certain lawyer comes to Jesus in this particular scene. The Pharisees had heard him, and he had put the Sadducees to silence. And all these were gathered together, and there was one of them which was a lawyer, verse 35. And he had a question. Now notice this. He had a question to tempt Jesus. He said, Master, which is the greatest commandment in the law? What is the most important thing in God's book? Well, notice the response. Jesus said to him, verse 37, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. The second's like unto it. Thou shalt love the Lord, or thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Verse 40, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Understand something that he's saying here. We must find a way to treat others as we would treat ourselves. We must find a way in our lives to treat others as ourselves. Now, I want us to make a connection to things that's happening. I want you to go all the way back to verse 23. Here are the Sadducees. Now, we understand in verse 23, this is the same day as all these other things in chapter 22 are happening. The Sadducees came to Jesus and asked him about the resurrection. They said, verse 24, saying, Master, Moses said, if a man die having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up seed unto her brother. Now, if there were with us 7 brethren, at the first, when he had married a wife, deceased and having no issue, left his wife unto his brother, likewise the second also, and the third, or unto the 7th. And last of all, the women died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be of the 7? Understand that in what the Pharisees and the Sadducees were trying to do to Jesus were to trick him. But I want you to see something, and I believe this is important. What's happening in Matthew chapter 22, beginning off verse 34, comes off of the cuff of, in eternity, are we going to be married together? Now, apply the concept of marriage to verse 34 down. And I want you to read with me verse 39 this way. And the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy spouse as thyself. Make the application to marriage. Now, I understand the broad application is loving everyone the way we would love ourselves, treating everyone the way we would want to be treated. What happens when we apply that principle to marriage? What happens when we make an effort, when we make a point to apply verse 39 to our wives and to our husbands and to all the members of our families? And God forbid, what happens when we apply that principle to the church. You see, a regular principle that's talking about something in life has to do with applying this loving idea of loving your neighbor to your spouse. See what changes in your mentality that makes. And we see in the fact that in this particular scene, that companionship must last. Because here's what I mean by that. Do you remember when you were dating? You see, for some of you, you've messed up and you've told me stories of when you were dating. And Robert and Belinda, I'm sorry. But you told me of the day that you were dating. And Robert, you brought Belinda home. And Mark ran and told his daddy that they were on the front porch. Do you remember the companionship in that moment? You know, technology does many things for us, and recently on my phone, Facebook gave me a on this day notification to tell me something that happened on this day. And it was a picture of me and Kelly. Before we had Chip, before we had Charlie, we were fresh in our marriage, right in the middle of Memphis. And I remember that day. Do you remember those days? Do you remember the companionship, the courtship you had before you were married? There's something that led you to marry your spouse, and it probably had to do with the principle in Matthew 22 of loving this neighbor as yourself. But there was probably a priority in the companionship, the courtship stage, in which we treated that person like nobody else upon this earth. That's got to last. And that's hard. But it has to be something in which we apply. And then in the fourth place, I want us to remember this. Marriage is something, when we try to define it, when we ask the question, what is marriage? Marriage is something that has vows. Marriage is something that has vows. You know, one of the biggest destroyers inside of marriage is disappointment. One of the biggest destroyers inside of marriage is disappointment. Now, whether we're talking about emotional disappointment, physical disappointment, or even other types of disappointment that exist, one of the biggest issues is disappointment. And one of the most frequent ideas inside of this is breaking a promise. Another frequent problem inside of disappointment is the lack of communication inside of marriage. Usually, breaking a promise and the lack of communication go hand in hand. Now, that's not always the case, but usually that's where they stand. You know, we have to be people who keep our word. Go with me to the book of James, James chapter 5. I want us to apply another simple principle, another really simple principle unto our marriages from James chapter 5. I want you to go with me to verse 12, James chapter 5, verse 12. But above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by the earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yea be yea, and your nay be nay, lest you fall into condemnation. We have to be a people who keep our words. We have to be a people who communicate. And we have to be a people inside of marriage that fulfill our promises. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to remember one of the most important promises you ever made. Number one, if you're a child of God in this room, married or not, you made a promise when you became a child of God that you would be His. Don't forget that promise. But behind that, inside of marriage, there was a promise that was made, and it usually goes along the lines like this. I took this exact clip from one of the last marriages I did or performed in 2016. Listen to what it says. Do you take blank to be your lawful wedded wife and constant friend, to love, honor, and cherish in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, forsaking all others, until death do you part. I want you to remember something this morning. I want you to remember that inside of your marriage you took vows. If you're not married this morning, I know some of you young people are not thinking about marriage, and there's two of you here that are thinking about it really seriously. I want you to remember this. Marriage has everything to do with your vows. You made a promise. You made a promise. And don't forget it. For those of you looking to get married, for those of you that are not married, not even thinking about it, I want you to never forget this. Marriage involves a promise. And one of the biggest disappointments in life is when a promise gets broken. Apply that to marriage. What happens when we break our vows? When we break that promise that we made. You know, it's healthy for a couple to periodically remember the promises that they made. I know for many of you, you may not have your vows written down, but I'm pretty sure you remember them. And it's healthy inside of marriage to go through those things and review them. Here's some questions for you. Is God in your marriage? Are you being fair with your spouse? Has companionship survived inside of your marriage? And do you remember your vows?
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His